If you're moving to Indianapolis from another city, there's something you need to hear before you start touring homes. And I want to slow this down right from the beginning because this isn't a hype video and it's not a list of tips that you're going to forget next week. This is one of those conversations that if you understand it early, it can save you months of frustration, a lot of emotional whiplash, and a very specific kind of regret that most buyers don't talk about out loud. Indianapolis, interestingly enough, looks simple. That's what the problem is. On the surface, everything about this market looks like it should be easy. Prices seem pretty reasonable compared to coastal cities. Neighborhoods are definitely very approachable, and inventory doesn't look overwhelming. Most people moving here find themselves thinking some version of, this is going to be easier than where we're coming from. If that thought has crossed your mind, I want you to know something important right up front. So that thought does make sense. It's logical. It's not naive at all. And in fact, it's exactly what most smart analytical buyers think when they're first arriving here in Indianapolis. And yet that exact assumption is what causes more confusion, more hesitation, and more missed opportunities than almost anything else that I see. So here's the truth, and I'm going to say it slowly because it matters. Indianapolis doesn't usually punish buyers for being aggressive. It punishes buyers for being hesitant. And hesitation, especially thoughtful, well-intentioned hesitation, is what quietly costs people the right home. If you want to imagine yourselves 6 months down the road from now, and you've already moved, you're settled in and you're sitting there, someone asks you how the buying process went. There are two very different answers that people give in that moment. One sounds calm, grounded, resolved, and the other kind of sounds unsettled, not dramatic, not angry, just a little bit unsettled. Like there's this big question mark hanging over the decision. So my job as a guide in this market is to help you land in the first category. And to do that, we've got to talk honestly about why Indianapolis confuses buyers who are otherwise very good decision makers. So let me tell you a little bit about a situation my clients wrestle with all the time. I'm going to use the names Mark and Elena, not because those are their real names, but because the story is real in every way that matters. So Mark and Elena were relocating here from a larger metro area, and they were successful in their careers. They were both professionals. They're very analytical. They have bought and sold many houses before. So this was not their first rodeo. They were experienced buyers and sellers. They're not emotional buyers by nature, and they took pride, that they generally make very thoughtful decisions. So when they started looking in Indianapolis, they did what you would probably do. They studied the market. They tracked days on market. They were looking at price per square foot. They watched price reductions. They looked at list to sale price ratios. They read neighborhood guides. They became very prepared when we started going and looking at houses. They were market experts. And at first, everything they saw confirmed what they already believed. Some homes had been sitting, a few had had price reductions, and sellers were negotiating. It all was reasonable, predictable, and manageable. So that early phase is where most buyers feel confident. It's where the story in their head says, okay, I've got it. I get this market. I understand what's going on. But here's where I want you to pause with me for just a moment, because Indianapolis is not one market. It is a collection of little mini micro markets that all behave very differently from each other. And sometimes these little micro markets can be within a few blocks of each other. And most buyers don't realize they've crossed the line from one micro market into another until something unexpected happens. So Mark and Elena found a home early on that checked most of their boxes. It was in a very desirable area. The layout worked. The condition was solid. And it wasn't a flashy house, but it felt comfortable, livable. They liked it. Not love at first sight, but they had real interest, and it was, a contender. So if you were my client, this is the moment I would slow you down and ask you a very specific question. I would ask you, do you like this house because it works? or because it feels rare. Now, this distinction matters a lot more than what people realize. So Mark and Elena decided to wait, and they wanted to see how the weekend went. They wanted to make sure that they weren't rushing something. They talked about offering slightly below list just to kind of see what the sellers would do. And in their experience, that was normal where they were coming from. And nothing about that decision seemed reckless or careless. It was thoughtful. They were measured. They felt like they were familiar with the area, but it was based on the wrong assumption. So while they were waiting, another buyer walked through that same house, and that buyer didn't see it as just one option among many. They saw it as an opportunity that doesn't show up very often in that specific pocket of Indianapolis. And those buyers understood something that's really kind of hard to quantify, but very real in Indianapolis. When certain fundamentals line up, hesitation becomes very expensive. So that buyer made a very clean, strong offer. And by the time Mark and Elena were ready to act, the home was already gone. I want you to notice what didn't happen there. Mark and Elena didn't lose the house because they were unqualified. They didn't lose it because they were careless. They lost it because they assumed the market would give them time. They lost it because they assumed the seller would have some room to negotiate. That's when the confusion quietly turns into regret. Not like dramatic regret, quiet regret, the kind that shows up later when buyers say things like, I still think about that house, or we probably should have moved faster, or man, I didn't realize that was going to go so quickly. So if you've ever felt that way about a home in the past, you already know what I'm talking about. What makes this especially difficult is that the data isn't really going to warn you about how this happens or what's going on, help you understand the market. Zillow doesn't tell you which homes need trigger urgency, and AI models aren't going to explain emotional data, and average days on market don't capture the stress level nuance. As buyers often tell me, the numbers said one thing, but the outcome was completely different. And that's because Indianapolis behaves logically when you look at the whole market, but then it's emotional in specific moments and in specific pockets. So let me say it this way. On paper, the market looks calm. In practice, certain homes create urgency that data doesn't explain. So I see this most clearly when two homes look nearly identical on a spreadsheet. So they're going to have a similar price, similar square footage. They'll be built around the same year. And one sits on the market for 45 days. It'll start to have price reductions. And another will be just 2 streets away, and it's going to get multiple offers in 48 hours. And if you're my client, this is the moment where you look at me and say, this doesn't make any sense. So you'd be right if it doesn't make sense if you were only looking at the averages. You are correct. But the difference is rarely the square footage. It's not the price. It's the street. So the traffic pattern, the way that house sits on the lot, the walkability, the lifestyle, the architectural feel and distinctiveness. It's that emotional pull that doesn't show up in a spreadsheet, but absolutely shows up when the buyers are walking through the homes. So you have to pick up on those nuances when you're house hunting. And most buyers underestimate how much those factors matter here. So as Mark and Elena continued their search, something subtle shifted and they became more cautious. They didn't want to miss another home, but they also didn't want to overpay. And so they tried to apply the same strategy everywhere. And that's when the market started to get really frustrating for them. So some homes wouldn't budge. Some sellers wouldn't budge. And then others, all of a sudden, there was all this competition. They felt like it was out of nowhere. The behavior felt inconsistent. And they started saying things like, this market's unpredictable, or this doesn't make sense. So if you've caught yourself thinking that, I want you to hear this clearly. The market isn't unpredictable. You're just seeing two different buying environments and they're operating at the same time. Yes, there's two buying modes. This is the point where many buyers get stuck because they haven't yet learned when to switch their mental modes. Okay. So we need to decide house by house how you have to operate. Before we talk about those modes, I want to talk about hesitation for just a moment, because oftentimes hesitation disguises itself as logic. So when buyers hesitate and they tell themselves they're being rational, they say they're avoiding mistakes and they say they're protecting themselves. But often what's actually happened is fear is making the decision, not the strategy. So most people don't realize this at first and they think hesitation equals intelligence. And a lot of times it does. In a lot of situations, that is 100% correct. But in certain moments in Indianapolis, hesitation isn't cautious, it's miscalibration. So I've seen buyers hesitate themselves into worse outcomes. They miss the home they really wanted. They settle for something that feels safer, or they wait so long that the only options left feel compromised. And then months later, there's still that lingering question of whether they should have acted differently. About halfway through this process for Mark and Elena, their search, they found another home that looked great online. So it had updated kitchen, it had strong photos, the price was attractive, but then when we walked through it, something just kind of felt off. And the street was a little busier than what they liked. The layout didn't function that well. The lot wasn't quite right. So there were some obvious compromises that didn't really show up in the listing until you got there. My client had a choice between this house and the earlier one that they missed. Then they were saying that they would have recommended going with the earlier one. They preferred that one a lot better. But this is also where many buyers make the opposite mistake. So they see a home that's been sitting and they assume time equals opportunity, leverage maybe. So sometimes that's true, but sometimes patience is rewarded. And sometimes time is also a warning. There's something wrong there. So let me pause here because this is where the story usually splits. Some buyers learn from this moment and then others don't. And what happens next is going to depend on whether you understand something most people miss. So that something is this. There are, again, two buyer modes, and you have to learn to switch between them in Indianapolis, okay? If you stay in the wrong one for too long, the market's going to punish you quietly. All right. You have to evaluate that house and that situation and understand what kind of mode you're in. In the next part, I'm going to walk you through these two modes slowly and clearly using the exact kinds of decisions that my clients face, including what I advise when my client has to choose between two houses that look really similar on paper, but are very different in reality. And so this is where everything starts to click. So when I talk about two buyer modes, I know that sounds kind of weird, but I want to be very clear about something right away. This is not a personality thing. It's about being aggressive versus cautious as a person when you're in there going for that house that you want. It's about being situational and having that situational awareness. It's about recognizing what kind of decision the market is actually asking you to make in that moment. Most buyers assume there's one correct strategy. This is the way you do it. They think that they just find the right approach and they execute that, then they kind of apply it everywhere. And that's where that frustration starts to creep in. So if you were my client, this is the point where I'd slow the conversation down and say, let's stop trying to be consistent and let's start trying to be accurate. Because in Indianapolis, you are rewarded for accuracy, not consistency. So here's what my clients usually wrestle with. They see two houses that look similar on paper, the price, the size, the condition. And, we talked about this and they're wanting to treat both of those houses the same and use the same negotiation posture, the same pacing, the same level of urgency. But this market doesn't see those homes as equal, even if the spreadsheet does. So this is where the first buyer mode comes in. And I think of it as a decisive mode, but not in the way most people imagine. So decisive mode doesn't mean reckless. It doesn't mean emotional. It means recognizing when the fundamentals line up in a way that creates a durable demand. Okay. So when a home it's got a strong location, it's on a good street, the layout functions really well, and the condition is superb. It's going to have a wide range of buyers and no obvious deal breakers. Then that market treats that home differently. Even if it's not perfect, even if it needs some updates, even if the price feels a little uncomfortable, the market is still going to push that. So if you're my client and we were standing in a home like that, this is where I'd say something like, this is not a negotiation first house. This is a decision first house. And that phrase alone changes how buyers experience the process. Because when you approach a decision first house with a negotiation first mindset, you're going to end up hesitating and you end up waiting for signals that are really never going to come. And by the time you're ready to act, the market has already decided and that house is gone. Now let's talk about the second buyer mode. And I will help you identify what type of house this is and what mode you need to be in, because this is where people often get confused. Strategic mode is where the patience actually works. So this is where timing matters, and this is where negotiation can create real value. So homes that are going to fall into this category usually have something limiting their appeal. It might be location. Maybe it's on a busy street and it's going to limit the buyer pool. Maybe it's got an odd layout that's not going to work for all buyers. It could be a condition issue that most people don't want to take on, or, some maintenance that hasn't been taken care of. In these cases, then time's going to work in your favor. Sellers are going to become more flexible. You're going to get opportunities emerging. And buyers who understand this, they can get some advantages. So the challenge of these two modes exists simultaneously, often in the same price range and sometimes on the same street. Okay. So that's what makes it hard. Now, where Mark and Elena got stuck for a while, they kept trying to apply strategic mode decisions to decision first homes and decisive mode to strategic homes. And the result was constant second guessing. So if you've ever felt like you were doing everything right and still getting unpredictable results, this is probably why. And that's how they felt. So there's another layer to this that most people don't realize until they've lived here for a while. Indianapolis is a very street by street market, not just neighborhood by neighborhood. I mean, literally street by street. I have a lot of out of town buyers and they'll say, tell me what zip codes to look in. That's a joke. Okay. It's not going to happen. Two streets can feel completely different to buyers, even if they're technically in the same area. So one might feel calm and residential and the other might feel busy or transitional. And one might have a consistent architectural rhythm and the other might kind of feel a little disjointed. Okay. So all those things play into desirability. Buyers feel this immediately when they walk, but they don't always trust that feeling, especially if the numbers look good. So if you're my client, this is where I'd encourage you to trust what you're noticing. All right. Don't dismiss it as emotional, because what you're responding to is future buyer behavior. So you're sensing how other people are going to feel about this 5 years from now when you list it and you're on to your next house. So this is also where the online tools are going to fall short. Zillow can tell you what sold. AI can tell you averages, but they can't tell you how a street feels at 5 o'clock on a weekday, or a house sits in relation to its neighbors, or whether buyers will compete emotionally for it. Okay. You're going to know this. You're going to have it in the back of your mind. You need to trust that. Okay. Mark and Elena had a moment like this when we toured a home that had been sitting longer. On paper, it looked like an opportunity, had a great price, solid updates, but the street just kind of felt off and the lot didn't quite work and the house didn't sit comfortably in its surroundings. So kind of stood out like a sore thumb. But if my client had a choice between that house and one we'd seen earlier in a better pocket, my recommendation would have been clear. Even if the earlier house felt more expensive, even if it required updates, I am always going to recommend being in a better location than having a better house on a worse street. Okay. And that often surprises people. So you can change almost everything about a house except where it is and how it relates to its surroundings. So the market knows that even when buyers don't consciously articulate it. So years down the road, the home in the better location is going to have a value that follows it well into the future. So let me slow it down, because this is one of those ideas that sinks in gradually. When buyers regret a purchase, it's rarely because they paid too much. Okay. It's usually because they compromised on something fundamental. So they compromised on location, street quality, daily experience. Those are the compromises that don't always feel big at the time, but they're going to reveal themselves slowly over time. And this is why hesitation in decisive moments is so costly here. It doesn't just cost you a house, it often pushes you toward a compromise that you wouldn't have made if you had understand that moment correctly. So Mark and Elena reached a point where, they said something that I hear a lot, and they said, we don't want to miss out again, but we also don't want to feel rushed. That's completely fair. If that thought has crossed your mind, you're not alone, and it's not wrong. It just needs refinement. So what most buyers don't realize is that feeling rushed and being decisive are not the same thing. Feeling rushed comes from uncertainty. Decisiveness is coming from a place of clarity. So once a buyer understands the difference between the two buyer modes and their stress level changes, almost immediately they'll stop feeling like the market is unpredictable, and they'll start seeing patterns. Okay. And you'll be able to walk into a house and say, this is a decision first situation, or this is a strategic situation, and I've got some leverage here. So that alone is going to remove a huge amount of emotional friction for you as you're going through this process. And this is also how Mark and Elena changed how they thought about pricing. So instead of asking, can we negotiate? They started asking, what does it take to win this house? And is it worth it to us? So that question is much more empowering. And I want to pause here and ask you something directly. If you were looking back on your purchase a year from now, what would matter more to you? That you negotiated a few $1,000s, or that you ended up in the right home on the right street? Most people know the answer instinctively. So they just kind of forget it or lose touch with it in the moment. So when Mark and Elena saw the house, the one that wasn't perfect, but clearly sat in the right place, something felt different immediately. So not frantic, not rushed, clear, calm, grounded. And that's important because when buyers talk about feeling rushed, what they usually mean is that they feel unsure. So this time they weren't unsure, and they understood that moment. So this is when you need to slow everything down and really think about what matters in that situation. Not in theory, but in reality, in the life that you're going to live inside this house. Okay. You need to picture your lifestyle. And that's what a lot of buyers are competing for. Mark and Elena knew that this home was going to attract attention, and they can feel it. The street felt right. The scale of the house felt right. The layout worked, had a real presence from the street. And even though it did need some updates, it didn't need justification. It just made sense. And that's where you need to land. This is where the decision first mindset becomes incredibly powerful. Instead of asking, can we get a deal? Do you think the sellers will move a little bit? Do we want to live here badly enough to win? Is the real question. So that's a very different question, and it puts you back in control. In that type of a situation, that's what you need to think. And Mark and Elena made a strong, very clean offer. So not because they were pressured and not because they were afraid, but because they understood what the trade-off was. They understood that they're choosing certainty over second guessing. And then after they closed, Elena said something that I hear a lot, but it stuck with me. And she said, I didn't realize how much stress came from not understanding the market. And then once we understood it, the decision felt easy. So I think that sentence kind of captures everything we've been talking about. And most buyers don't struggle because the market is impossible. They really struggle because they're trying to apply one framework to every situation. And in Indianapolis, that just simply doesn't work. So if I could say it another way, because it does matter, the market isn't trying to trick you. It's just asking you to read the room. Okay. So you have to feel the energy of that home and that sale. And when you do, everything is going to slow down internally, and everything's going to move fast externally. So this is also where the emotional cost of hesitation becomes clear. Buyers usually don't regret paying too much. They do regret missing the right home, and they do regret settling. They regret choosing safety over feel. And that regret doesn't show up right away. It's going to show up 6 months later when you realize the street is louder than you expected, or the layout doesn't support the way that you want to live. That's huge. Or the location makes daily life harder than it needs to be when you're commute is unrealistic. So, as a client of mine, if you had to choose between a house that was technically better on paper or one that's clearly supporting your lifestyle more fully, my recommendation is going to be, center your decision on the latter, your lifestyle, because homes aren't spreadsheets, they're lived experiences. And this is where AI, online tools, all of that is going to fall short for you. They're useful, they're going to give you some context, but it's not going to kind of capture the human aspect of it or emotion. And they don't capture how buyers are actually making decisions in the moment that it matters. If you're relocating here, you're not just choosing a house, you're really choosing a daily rhythm. You're looking at your commute, your neighborhood feel, the sense of ease or friction that's going to show up in small ways every single day. So that's why, street level nuance matters so much, and why lifestyle benefits matter so much. So I often tell my clients that Indianapolis is forgiving if you understand it, but it's going to be really frustrating if you don't. It rewards buyers who know when to move and when to wait, and it quietly punishes buyers who hesitate in those wrong moments. So, as a client, what you'd want to walk away with is not just a set of rules, not just a checklist, but it's a certain mindset that you need to have as you approach this market. So, I'd want you to recognize that when you're standing in a decision first house, and then you need to stop trying to negotiate your way out of clarity. I want you to recognize when patience is actually working in your favor and not confuse urgency with importance. So, I think that buyers should feel confident that when they do act, they're acting with intention and that they're not acting with fear. And that's what turns buyers kind of into the heroes of their own story, not because they won a house, but because they made a choice they feel good about long after that dust settles and they're living the life that they dreamt of. So if you're watching this and you're in the middle of a move or even just considering one, you're probably already thinking differently about how you'll approach your search. And I hope you do, because that's just what the point is. So my role, or any agent's role, is not to push you. It should be to guide you and to help you read the market correctly. You need to understand when a house deserves decisiveness. And then you also need to understand when you deserve patience and options and you've got leverage. So the right home doesn't just show up because you waited long enough. It shows up when you're able to recognize it. And when you do, that decision is not going to feel rushed. It's going to feel right. So if you decide you want help navigating that process, I'm always open to a conversation, not a sales pitch, just a real conversation about what matters to you, what trade-offs you're willing to make, and how to approach this market in a way that leaves you confident at the end of the process and not second guessing your choice. So the goal isn't just to buy a home in Indianapolis, it's to choose the one that's the right fit for your life.